of monitoring that chat. And at the end of the presentations, we'll be asking those questions to John and to Jen. So feel free to put those questions in at any time. So to get us started, I'm now pleased to introduce Susan Liebeck, our chapter's research information volunteer and a chapter board member, who's going to introduce our featured speakers. Susan.
Hey, everybody. I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. We have Dr. Jonathan Rosen and Dr. Jennifer Scher. Dr. Rosen is an associate director in the research department at JDRF, where he oversees the Improving Lives program, including glucose control, metabolic control, complications, and psychosocial health. Dr. Rosen earned his undergraduate degree in molecular biology from Princeton University and his PhD in genetics from Harvard Medical School, where he also studied cardiac and vascular biology. Dr. Rosen did his postdoctoral training at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, where he performed research on the cell biology of skeletal muscle. And he has been with JDRF since 2017. And we also are pleased tonight to have Dr. Jennifer Scher. She is an associate professor at Yale Medical School. She completed her undergraduate and medical school training through an accelerated joint BA-MD program at Rutgers University. And she did her pediatric residency and pediatric endocrinology fellowship at Yale, where she also earned a PhD. Dr. Scher has focused, sorry, my computer's doing weird stuff, her career on clinical strategies to improve closed-loop insulin delivery, and she has worked on a number of JDRF-funded research projects. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rosen and Dr. Scher.
Everyone's clapping. John, you want to go ahead and get started?
Sure. So Susan, thank you for the really nice introduction. I think what we'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about my background and how I came to be at JDRF, and then Dr. Scher will do the same, and then we'll jump into the research. So like Susan said, before this job, before I joined JDRF in 2017, I was working as a postdoctoral researcher at Sloan Kettering Hospital. I've always loved science. I studied biology. I got my graduate degree, and it was fascinating and exciting. But at a certain point in my last job, I was at the lab bench every day, kind of working away, mostly by myself. And I started to feel a little bit unfulfilled. Even though I still love the science, I started to really want to sort of work for something bigger and work as part of an organization doing bigger things, but still as a scientist. And I didn't have a type 1 diabetes connection in my life, which is different from many other scientists at JDRF. And I sort of stumbled into JDRF backward. I started asking around, I'm a young-ish scientist. I'm kind of early in my career. What are some things I can do that are mission-driven, have a sense of purpose? And JDRF came recommended to me. And then luckily there was a job opening there at the time. And I was very lucky to get this job. I've loved it. And I haven't looked back. Now it's a few years later. My responsibilities have changed a little bit over time, but it remains that what I work on is what we call our Improving Lives program, which I'll tell you much more about in a few minutes, which is all about developing drugs and devices and mental health interventions to improve outcomes in people who have type 1 diabetes. And thank you for the opportunity to be here and tell you about what we do.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Jen.
So I really appreciate everybody joining tonight. It is a pleasure to see a number of familiar faces and a number of familiar names. And it's great because I've gotten to know Dr. Rosen over the past couple of years, having the opportunity to work with him closely on a number of different endeavors. So for those of you who don't know, I was diagnosed with diabetes in 1987, participated in numerous walks, was a vigorous fundraiser for the organization, and definitely always felt home with JDRF. And as I was diagnosed, I immediately said I wanted to be a pediatric endocrinologist. I was on a path, it was going to happen, but I was going to be a clinician because my mom was a clinical research nurse. And I thought, who in their right mind would do this? I watched what she did every single day, and that was not for me. And so I went to medical school. I came up to Yale. I was doing my pediatric residency, and I met Bill Tamberlane. And I sat in his office and I told him, I want to do fellowship here and I want to do training. And he said to me, I said, I'm interested in learning more about statistics. And he goes, really what you want to do is get a PhD. I did not want to get a PhD. That was not on my life plan. But he pointed out to me that I could take care of a handful of patients or persons living with diabetes over the years, or I could help so many more. And it was like the fire was set. I was going for that PhD and I have not looked back. And I think it's been really phenomenal to be part of so many various opportunities with things that have come out, nasal glucagon, various automated insulin delivery systems, working with Jonathan on new programs that are ongoing. And it's just an amazing time. And to look at the purified pork I used to take to where we are today, I'm very pleased. So I'll be quiet now and happy to discuss more later. Oh, John, you're on mute.
All right, shall I jump in?
You got it, John. I was giving you a nice intro, but I realized I was on mute. But yes, please take it away.
Okay. So what we're going to do now is often people are interested to hear about the research happening at JDRF. We do so many exciting things. And like I said, it's really my pleasure to be able to tell you about some of it. But before I jump into the specific research we're working on, I want to tell you a little bit about what it is that scientists at JDRF do, because I found that sometimes people imagine there's a lab at JDRF and we wear gloves and do experiments ourselves. And that's not the case. We don't have facilities. What we do is we partner like crazy. So the way JDRF works is we bring in money from really generous donors who are interested in supporting the development of treatments and cures for type 1 diabetes. And then the scientists on staff, including me, it's our job to find the best projects with the best scientists in the whole world that we can fund with the donor money to advance our goals. We partner with academics like Dr. Scher. We partner with companies, biotechs, pharmaceuticals, governments, NGOs. We partner with everyone globally who's interested in working with us to develop new cures and treatments for type 1 diabetes and its complications. The other point I want to make before I jump into the research is that even though the R in JDRF stands for research, we actually do a lot more than that. So if you imagine everything that has to happen to get a drug or a device to market for people to use, it's very complicated and it's very advanced. You do preclinical testing, you do clinical trials, you get regulatory approvals from the FDA, you get governments and insurance companies to cover the therapies and devices, otherwise no one's going to be able to use them. And JDRF handles every single step of this pathway. As an example, we have a regulatory affairs office in Washington, D.C., where JDRF staff work, and it's their full-time job to interact with the FDA and to interact with the companies that we partner with to ensure that the drugs and devices which we are advancing for type 1 diabetes eventually get approvals and make it into the hands of people who need them. And our metric for how well we're doing isn't publications or interesting scientific discoveries, which are all great, but what matters to us is the outcomes, and then whether people with type 1 diabetes have access and are able to use and enjoy better outcomes in their health from all of these products that we're working on. Now, JDRF has 5 research priorities. First one is very easy to explain. It's the training of young scientists and clinicians. We're invested in making sure not just now, but 10 years and 20 years and 30 years from now, the best scientists in the whole world are interested in type 1 diabetes. And so we fund people early in their career. In some cases, they're already in type 1 diabetes. In some cases, we entice people into the field and then try to lock them in. So now we have, not just funded one grant, but kickstarted a whole career in type 1 diabetes research. Now, our other areas are the science parts. One is we're advancing science to establish global universal screening. This means testing people in the general population to see if they're at risk for developing type 1 diabetes. And the reason to do this is, one, if people know they're at risk for getting type 1 diabetes, their chances of getting DKA at diagnosis is much, much, much lower, approaching 0, because they know what symptoms to watch out for. Second is that if people know that they're at risk for type 1 diabetes, they'll have the opportunity to participate in clinical trials for drugs that will prevent the onset of type 1 diabetes. And once we have drugs that can prevent the onset of type 1 diabetes, these people will be eligible to take them. Our second area is called disease-modifying therapies. This means drugs to prevent the onset of type 1 diabetes, or to really nip it in the bud, and as soon as you've been diagnosed, stop it from going any further. Our third area is beta cell therapies. So in type 1 diabetes, because of the autoimmune attack, people lose their beta cells. So this scientific area is all about finding ways to get beta cells from another source, either an animal or stem cells, and implant them into the person with type 1 diabetes to restore insulin independence. And these are all really promising sort of curative approaches, we can call them cures, that are in development. None of that is what I'm going to be talking about today. That's an overview of our whole scientific program. What I'm going to be telling you about is the program I lead, which is called Improving Lives. And I know that's a very general sounding thing, but what it really means, what it boils down to, is drugs, devices, and behavioral health interventions for people who already have type 1 diabetes. The idea is that many of our other programs are geared toward preventing type 1, but JDRF will never forget about the people who already have the disease, and will keep working to better health and happiness in our population. So the vision of the Improving Lives program is simply a world where people with type 1 diabetes live healthy and burden-free lives. A theme that I'll bring up a couple times in this presentation is that for JDRF, mental health and quality of life are just as important as hard clinical endpoints like A1C. And that's something that I think has been lost in the research community too often, and we're really sort of advocating for. So the Improving Lives program covers 4 areas. One is devices. So that's AP systems, better pumps, better CGMs, and algorithms that link them together. Second is drugs for glucose control. This is next generation insulins, much, much better than what's on the market now, and what are called adjunctive therapies, which means non-insulin drugs that you take along with insulin to get better outcomes than you could with insulin alone. Third is drugs for long-term complications, where we focus on eye and kidney disease, which remain very important challenges for type 1 and that we invest in research for. And last is psychosocial burden. So we know that people with type 1 diabetes disproportionately are affected by certain mental health issues, and that among people with type 1, if you have some of these mental health issues, you're more likely to have other negative outcomes like high A1C. And for this reason, we support the development of diabetes-focused behavioral health interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy and things like this to improve mental health among people with type 1. Another topic which has not received enough attention and investment from the community. What I'm going to be focusing on today, since this is just too much to cover everything, is drugs and devices for glucose and metabolic control. So I'm going to start here sort of with a dumb rhetorical question, which is, why do we need drugs and devices? We already have 3 hybrid closed loop systems on the market. We've had insulin for 100 years. Kind of what more do we want? Why isn't this enough? And the answer is obvious. It's that the epidemiological data bear out what people with type 1 diabetes intuitively know already, which is that these tools aren't good enough. Most people with type 1 aren't meeting the A1C targets recommended by the American Diabetes Association. There's still too much time spent in hyperglycemia, high blood sugar, and hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. And every day there's this enormous burden of all the decision-making you have to do with type 1. And of course, none of this is because people with type 1 aren't doing a good enough job with managing the disease. It's because the tools available to people just aren't good enough. And that's where JDRF comes in to form research partnerships to make better drugs and better devices. And we'll start with drugs. So everyone with type 1 diabetes takes insulin. What we want to do is get beyond insulin alone as the treatment for type 1 diabetes. If you have type 2 diabetes, and you go to your doctor, there's, and Dr. Scher can confirm this is true when she speaks, because she's a real doctor and I just know a lot of them and read their papers. There's all these options, and you'll work with your doctor to find the right drug or the right combination of drugs that works for you and gives you the best health outcomes and quality of life. And that's where we want to get for type 1 diabetes. And again, these are called adjunctive therapies, drugs you take alongside insulin, not instead of it, but with it to improve outcomes. And now there's really 2 kinds of outcomes we want to improve with these adjunctive therapies. One is glucose control. Even though insulin is the greatest blood sugar lower, ever developed by God or nature, it's just not working well enough. We know that. So if you add on other drugs, you can bring your glucose into the range where you want it without, better than you can with insulin alone. And we have a couple approaches to finding these drugs. One is to go to the type 2 diabetes field. Many drugs developed for type 2 diabetes have some benefits for type 1. And it's JDRF's role to do clinical trials with these drugs, demonstrate their benefits in type 1, and entice companies in the field to bring in type 1 diabetes, include people with type 1 in their clinical trials, get regulatory approvals for type 1 so that the whole community can benefit from these drugs that already exist. Another source of these drugs is ones we're making from scratch. The type 2 diabetes drugs are good. Many of them have benefits for type 1 and we'll keep working with them. But it also stands to reason that drugs developed with type 1 diabetes in mind from the beginning will have special benefits for people with type 1. So we are devoted to some of those programs as well. Another important thing about adjunctive therapies is that besides giving better glucose control than what you can get with insulin alone, is they address what we call broader metabolic imbalances. So there's sort of a misconception that in type 1 diabetes, the only thing wrong is glucose control. But actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. And people with type 1 experience other of these metabolic imbalances, things like insulin resistance and ketone levels, and frequently obesity. And it's important to address all of these other issues, not just glucose control, in order to get the best long-term health outcomes that are possible. And insulin by itself is powerless to address some of these imbalances. And in some of them, like obesity, is actually the culprit because insulin promotes weight gain, and you need additional therapies to address all these other things. And I'm going to tell you about one or two of these therapies which improve both glucose control and these other metabolic imbalances. The first one is a class of drugs called GLP-1, and this includes commercial names like Victoza and Ozempic. These are drugs that are approved for type 2 diabetes, and they give you better glucose control. They promote beneficial weight loss, and data keeps emerging that they improve long-term kidney and heart outcomes. And not just because they lower blood sugar. We know if you lower blood sugar, you'll get better kidney and heart outcomes. That's why we really care about blood sugar in the first place. But these drugs improve those outcomes beyond just the effect of glucose lowering. And so we're very interested in working with companies, working with academics to test these drugs in type 1 diabetes and advocate for their use as the results sort of justify. Now, the second class I want to tell you about is called SGLT inhibitors. This includes Forxiga and Zynquista. This is a very interesting class of drugs. I can tell you how it works. It causes you to pee out extra blood sugar, which is a safe way to remove it. The sugar is toxic in your blood, so you get it out of your body. These have been tested fairly extensively in people with type 1 diabetes. They have great benefits, including lowering your A1C, increasing your time in range, which means how much time you spend in the glucose range you want, 70 to 180. These drugs, just like the other class I was describing, have been shown to improve kidney and heart outcomes in non-T1D populations where they've been tested, like people with type 2 diabetes or non-diabetic people who are prone to heart failure. And so you might be wondering, if these drugs are so great, why isn't everyone taking them already for type 1 diabetes? And unfortunately, there's a catch, which is that these clinical trials revealed that the drugs, in addition to all the benefits I just described, caused an increased risk of DKA in people with type 1 diabetes, which is rare but extremely serious. And so it's become clear in the field that it's this risk of DKA which is preventing widespread adoption of these drugs, which have so many benefits. And so JDRF is closely focused on addressing this DKA risk to promote the use of these drugs so people can have better blood sugar and long-term heart and kidney outcomes. And I think Dr. Scher may comment on that when she goes as well. So now I'm going to switch from drugs into devices, which are there to sort of accomplish some of the same things, such as to give you better glucose control. So we're doing a bunch of new things in our device program. And the reason is that we've been successful so far and are now moving to the next frontier. There's a thriving market for AP systems. And we're not gonna, keep making just sort of bells and whistles on existing products. And I'm just gonna quickly tell you about a couple things that we're working on in this field, which are really exciting. One is using AP systems at an earlier stage of disease. We're funding an amazing clinical trial called CLEVER, which is an acronym, but also a good description for the investigators working on it, one of whom is Dr. Scher, who will tell you all about it. My sort of teaser is that this is testing AP systems in people who've just been diagnosed to see how much the benefits, one, extend to them in terms of blood glucose control, but also whether this can save beta cells from immune destruction if you use the system early enough. A second thing we're working on in the AP program is closing the loop. So we have 3 hybrid closed loop systems on the market, where hybrid closed loop means that it does most of the glucose and insulin management for you, but you still have to manually input how much, your meals and during periods of exercise. It still requires sort of user interaction. We want to get to a place where the system is fully closed, meaning that the user has minimal or no interactions with the devices. One way we're trying to achieve this goal is by developing drugs that can bring down mealtime blood sugar. So one of the main barriers to making fully closed loop systems with no user interaction is that when you eat a meal, your blood sugar rises too much too fast for a closed loop algorithm to handle. So we're working on drugs like rapid acting insulins and an adjunctive therapy called Simlin that we think can blunt that rise in blood sugar, which will be good for everyone with type 1, including injection users, but will have a special benefit for closed loop users, which is that it'll allow them to use algorithms which they just don't even have to engage with. Just set it and forget it. I think that gives you a very quick overview of our activities in both drugs and devices. And I just want to end this short talk by thanking everyone for all that you do. JDRF, started, I think, like 50 years ago or so. And our founding mothers, I should say our founders, the people we call our founding mothers, were 2 people who had kids with type 1 diabetes and wanted to do something for them. And they started JDRF at their kitchen table, and we've been making progress ever since. So it's not an exaggeration to say that everything we've accomplished is because of the passion and generosity and thoughtfulness of people with type 1 and the people who love them from our very founding up till now. And so we've made so much progress, and I'm glad I could provide a couple highlights. We still have a long way to go. And the closer we get, the more there is to do. We're now funding, I think, like 70 clinical trials or something. This was a number unheard of 10 years ago or even 8 years ago. And then that shows, how close we're getting to the finish line, that we have real drugs and real devices that are in testing. And then we're going to keep it up until we get over the finish line and people with type 1 actually have access to all of these things. So I'll stop here, and happy to talk further during our Q&A.
Excellent. Thanks, John. I'm going to pass it over to Jen now, Dr. Scher.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much again for joining us this evening. And thank you, Jonathan, for that excellent, review of things. I think the interesting thing about all of this is I'm writing little notes as Jonathan is speaking, and I'm thinking about the fact that, there are all these priority areas that JDRF goes ahead and focuses on. And I've had a unique perspective in the past few years. I have twice been asked to come to these meetings where they discuss research priority areas. So typically May, June, one year I was invited straight out. Another year there was a German scientist who couldn't make it, and the girl in New Haven could come to Manhattan pretty quickly. And so I was happy to be there. And what's interesting about it is it's a gathering of scientists from across the globe. And we're all there, and each of us is designated one specific priority area. Okay, I was there as metabolic control. Somebody's there for artificial pancreas. Somebody's there for beta cell preservation. And what I found to be so amazing in taking part of this is that you sit there, you get to learn so much. You can hear about all the amazing work that can be done and ideas that are important and ways we should structure what funds are coming in and where they should go next. And I think that, you know, I walk in and say, I want for my priority area, right? I go in and I say, I want stuff for metabolic control, and I want newer drugs, and I want newer agents. And then I leave and I go, oh my gosh, that psychosocial session was amazing, you know, and we definitely need more providers in that area. I look at my clinic alone, you know, we've just had some psychologists come on board and finally be available, but for years we've had a deficit in that. And so just to know that JDRF sees a priority in terms of saying, okay, you know what, this undiscussed burden of the mental toll of living with a chronic medical condition is important. We need not only trained psychologists who can go ahead and help the community, but also assess how new therapies we're going ahead and making, how does it impact the day-to-day life of somebody? Because we can say numbers look great, but numbers aren't life. And so what amazes me with all of that is this conversation that's held is with these scientists from around the world and then JDRF volunteers. And it is a back and forth. It is a, tell me more about this, you know, let's go over that again. And just sort of culminating with questions, and all the scientists at the end of the day, we present our final findings and then we get out. And the next day, the team from JDRF and the JDRF volunteers and advocates sit there and develop the next year's priority areas. So it's a really unique experience. In so many, you know, as an academic, I need to search for funding for research proposals that I want to do. You know, and the NIH may set this priority area and other founding bodies may set this priority area, but it's not necessarily a conversation in terms of where is priorities and what do we all see as being best. And so I think it's a really interesting opportunity to have that conversation. What builds on that even more is Jonathan mentioned the CLEVER trial. So I want to share with you a little bit more about what the CLEVER trial is, because it is quite clever. This is a study that was, you know, it started from the idea of back in the 80s, there were some studies that showed if you got really tight glycemic control right after diagnosis, there was retention of your insulin producing cells. Your disease course was much smoother. And so really the question was, okay, can we do this? And I can tell you, maybe 10 years ago, we tried this. We did this with a computer-based hybrid closed loop. We brought people in within 7 days of diagnosis. We put them on a closed loop system for 4 days, a very rudimentary one. And we trained them on sensor augmented pump therapy. So your sensor was reading your information directly to your pump. We sent them home and said, well, maybe that'll make a difference after a year's time. Turns out they were really bad tools. So at the end of a year, we found that the individuals who went into that intensively treated regimen, they were completely burnt out. This is where we needed that psychosocial aspect, because what we found was there was more depression, there was more anxiety. We did not mean to cause this in any of our participants. It was just something that came out because we were handing them tools, but the tools weren't really that great. And it was allowing them to see the glycemic variation they had, but not really affect change with it. And so we finished that study. We were very disappointed. We felt like, okay, we wish we had had a better outcome. And we look back a few years ago and said, well, we've got better tools now. Hey, guess what, guys? Like this may be possible. And so an investigator from the University of Minnesota started talking to people about this idea. And she said, you know, I really think we should test this again. Hybrid closed loops are now available commercially. People can go get them. What if we go ahead and start it right after diagnosis? And so a team of us from across the country came together, Stanford University, the Barbara Davis Center, Children's Mercy in Kansas City, Riley Children's in Indiana, the University of Minnesota, and then here at Yale. And so it's great because it actually started out with a couple of us, and then we're like, oh, we probably need more investigators to study the number of people. These people are really smart, grab them. And now we're like, okay, well, how can we get funding for this? And we approached JDRF scientists and said, okay, we want to start a proposal and we want to go ahead and go through the process. And one of the things I love about working with the JDRF scientists is they work with you through the process of submitting a grant. So we have the pleasure of working with Jonathan and saying, here's what we're thinking. And he's like, well, have you thought about this? As an outside perspective, what about this? Where can we go next? And so what's interesting about the Clever trial is the way we posed it is we said somebody within 30 days of diagnosis will either go ahead and start on a hybrid closed loop. We're using the T-Slim Control IQ, which is commercially available, and the Medtronic 780G, which is not commercially available. So people are randomized to use one of those two systems. And that was our original proposal. And I guess it was 2 years ago now, Dr. Rosen, I'm like, we're all in a time warp with the pandemic and everything. So who knows what year we're in or what month it is. I'm just making it through the days. But what I will say is that 2 years ago, we were at the American Diabetes Association annual meeting. So all the scientists are together. And JDRF said, come on down to our local office here in California. We want to talk to you guys, get you all in a room. And what was neat about it is we all gathered together, and one of the JDRF volunteers, who happens to be a statistician by training, and so he came in, Randy Anderson, I think I said his name correctly, brilliant man. And he sat with us and he goes, guys, I really like what you're doing here, but have you thought about a factorial design? And we were like, no, because I'm not a statistician and factorial design did not pop up in my head. And what he pointed out to us is that because we're testing a device, we have the possibility of also testing a therapy that may change the course of diabetes. The two aren't thought to interact with each other. And so we could actually test two things at one time. So that would provide potential participants with more agents that could help them. That would provide the opportunity to conduct these important investigations with less cost, less time, less investigator output in terms of getting everything done. So it's a really efficient way to go ahead and do the study. And so we said, sitting around the table, yeah, we'll do this. And then they said, okay, well, which immunomodulator do we want to choose? And we went through and discussed them. And we talked about, okay, what are the benefits? What are the risks? And where are we going to go? And it was a very open conversation. And when we left that meeting, we went ahead and changed our entire protocol so that the protocol is now written so that individuals who weigh more than 30 kilograms at the time of diagnosis will also be randomized to either getting placebo or a study medication. The study medication we're using is verapamil. Verapamil is used for high blood pressure. It's out there, it's being used all the time, very cheap, right? Lots of people using it. But there's been a small study in adults with type 1 diabetes that showed individuals who were on verapamil had retention of their insulin producing cells over time. It was a really small study. So we really have to explore this more. And so we decided this is a medication that is easily available. It's a great opportunity to test it. And so now we have people enrolled across the country. I think we're at we just had a call last Friday, Jonathan, right? And I think we were at 70 participants across the country. And so we are really doing well, despite the pandemic, of getting people in and getting this studied. And it's been really amazing. And the thing I'm grateful for is, had this gone to any other funding body, we may have gotten a grant. We may have been able to do that initial study. But thanks to JDRF, we have the opportunity to create a better study that will help people with diabetes more and use those donations in a very thoughtful manner to test multiple things at once. And so I think that the other thing that Jonathan brought up that I, again, want to just sort of piggyback on is he was speaking about the class of SGLT2 inhibitors. And I am obsessed with this therapy. I can tell you that I had one of those early training grants. So during my early training grant, when JDRF did not need to entice me, but I like stuck my hooks in and said, please take me. And thankfully, in those early studies, I got to test GLP-1s, one of the therapies he was talking about, along with closed loop insulin delivery. This is back when closed loop was on a computer. I had to sit at the bedside, make sure the loop was staying closed. And then we also went ahead and did some early studies of SGLT2 inhibitors, that oral medication that you can take. And what we did is we did these studies where we went ahead and we knew there's this risk of having DKA at a much lower glucose level. And we said, well, is it the fact that ketones happen faster, or is it that you just don't get the signal? Your blood sugar doesn't go up, so you don't know to go ahead and test. And so we brought people with type 1 diabetes in to our research center. And at 3 a.m., we shut off their basal insulin delivery, and we saw how they did over the next 6 hours. We stopped if they had a glucose over 350 or if they had like moderate ketones. We don't want anybody to be sick, right? But it's important to sort of figure out exactly what's happening in these situations. And it was a very small study, only conducted here at Yale. And what we found was really, it's just that signal of the glucose gets to like the 190s to low 200, where the people who weren't taking the SGLT2, they're in the 300s. So obviously they'll be trained to say, go ahead and check for ketones now. So it's not that the ketones are happening faster. And then when we gave a dose of insulin, everything reversed exactly the same. So what we learned from that, and this again was JDRF funded, is guess what? We can do this. We just need to do it safely. So I've been a big proponent of SGLT, oh my gosh, now I can't even say it, SGLT2 therapy is going to be, I think, an amazing adjunctive option because it's going to protect our hearts. It's going to protect our kidneys. It has the opportunity to allow us to achieve improved glycemia with weight loss because it's an insulin sparing agent. And so to me, I'm just like, it reaps so many benefits. And if it means I just have to take a pill, I'm not constantly dosing something, it's phenomenal. So what is so interesting about all of this, in my viewpoint, is again, I had another very interesting experience with JDRF, that there was a call for research proposals where they said, we want to learn more about SGLT2s and how they might work in the type 1 population. And this is a common way that they go ahead and seek out grant proposals, and you write a short description of what you'd like to do, you send it in, and then they tell you whether or not they want to see everything that you're thinking about. And so it was in November of 2019 that we went ahead and sent in a letter, and Dr. Rosen called me and he said, we want to have a conference call with a few of you guys. And it was great because what he said was, we got 3 really good proposals and we want to bring you guys together. And so he went ahead and connected us all. And so we started having conference calls, and he said, you know what, you guys can't do this on your own. Let's get the JABE Center for Health Research involved because you need somebody to coordinate all of this activity. And over the next few months, we went through these processes of developing the protocol and the idea and everything else. And I will tell you, I can remember it quite well. It was March 16th, I want to say 2020, that I submitted the application. And the reason I know this is because I'm pretty sure I had COVID at that time. I had just gotten back from Madrid and I was sick as a dog on my couch. There was a huge diabetes meeting in Madrid. And as I was on the plane home, they were like, Madrid is the new hotspot for COVID. And so I was working from home, finishing up the grant, trying to get everything in, talking to all my collaborators, saying, I don't have any sense of smell or taste. And they kept saying, that's not COVID, but we learned. And so the amazing thing is the grant went in, and then the pandemic hit. And the reason I bring this up is because I hope Jonathan will still agree. I think it was good science. But with the hit that we had in terms of funding, he very kindly called me up and said, we know how hard you guys have worked. We know this is really important science, and we're not in a position right now. And so that grant that had spent months sort of trying to get through is sort of on the back burner. And this is absolutely what's happening in the climate. You know, it's one of those things where, and this is the way academic medicine is. We're constantly coming up with ideas. We really hope it's a good one. We really hope that it will be funded, but we recognize there's a limited amount to go around. And I think that this past year has seen a hit in terms of the donations received in a number of organizations. And what strikes me about this is that, you know, we are all very interested in improving diabetes care. And as somebody who, all I do is research, we have a whole staff that works with us. In the past year, I've had to let somebody go. And it's been one of those things that it just feels uncertain. But I know that JDRF is going to continue on the mission. I love that Jonathan is continuing to explore and, you know, get more. There's so much more even being developed right now that we're going to continue to build on these projects. And when the time is right, it's going to be an even better endeavor. And I have no doubt about that. But I think it's really a matter of we're at this critical juncture of there's really good science, there's really great opportunities. Hopefully the world will open back up again, and, you know, we'll be able to keep down this path. So please know that there is a lot of discussion with JDRF scientists, which I think is absolutely phenomenal. And I think it makes all of us better investigators, better researchers, and they help introduce us to each other academics, which is just phenomenal because we can create future collaborations. So in so many ways, I just think it's been wonderful, and I'm grateful for the partnership I have with Dr. Rosen. I'm happy to take any questions, or
Excellent.
I just talk a lot.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Jen. Appreciate it. Yeah, if you have a few minutes for questions, you certainly can either put them in the chat, or and Susan can read those there, or you can feel free to unmute yourself. But
So we've got one question in the chat. This is from Michael, saying if the SGLT2 grant gets approved and goes well, how long would it take to come to availability for Hannah? So in real life, how long is it going to take?
And I think that's such a great question. Oh, I'm sorry, Jonathan. Do you want me to? Okay. I'm just going to tell you from a different experience I had with working on nasal glucagon years ago. So we did those studies on nasal glucagon in 2013 and 2014. You know, that took until 2019 to be approved. That was a longer process. That was a small little company that was seeking to bring a revolutionary product out. But I think that what I know is it's a long road. There are a number of studies in SGLT2s in the type 1 population. In Europe, there are some SGLT2s that are already approved. Last year, I actually had the opportunity, one of the companies actually called me, and I went in front of the FDA to testify because the FDA here said, we're not going to approve this medication. And so I got to go in a closed room, and we sat on one side and members of the FDA sat on the other side, and we got to try and fight for it. And that company actually just put in another letter to the FDA saying, hey, this is really important. We can't forget the type 1 population. I'm supposed to draft a new letter for them this week. But I think that it does take a lot. It does take a lot of advocacy. And that's where JDRF is also hugely important, because you can find medications and therapies that can help improve lives. But I think helping regulators understand the risk benefits is essential. And I love the fact that Jonathan also brought up the idea. I'm just going to mention this as well. I'm sorry, I'm going off on such a tangent. We were talking about how one of the programs is looking at screening the general population and how people can potentially go ahead and enroll in prevention trials. And I look at things like toluzumab, which is an anti-CD3 agent that has been shown to go ahead and delay the onset of diabetes. And the FDA is currently reviewing that medication, and they designated it breakthrough status. And we anticipate we'll hear something about that this year in the not too distant future. So I'm hopeful that with the right studies, the right advocacy, things will go quicker, but I would never want to tell you how long the FDA is going to take.
So another question, not in the chat, but in my mind, so I'm going to ask it, is for these drugs that we already know have been approved for type 2 diabetes, is it possible for clinicians to prescribe that off-label for people with type 1? And if so, how do you go about trying to get that done for your child or yourself?
Do you want me to take that? Yeah. So I will tell you, as somebody with type 1 diabetes, I'm on an off-label therapy. I see a very brilliant endocrinologist, and it took me months of convincing that this was going to be okay. And I've been on it for a few years now. I've tried almost everything. I like to dabble. In terms of people who I follow, there are some guidelines that are set saying, you know, for individuals over the age of 18, we could consider trying something off label. We don't necessarily want to move to the adolescent population right away. You know, to make sure that people have the right, to make sure that people understand the risk of ketosis, and make sure that there's a plan in place to measure, knowing when to measure, and then knowing certain circumstances where you might need to stop one of those medications. So I really feel like use of any of these adjunctive agents right now is very much possible, but through a personalized medicine approach. And I think sometimes just broaching things with your doctor, it's good. You know, maybe you'll plant the seed, maybe it won't be at that first visit, and maybe they'll say, hey, you know what, I'm not comfortable with this, and that's okay. But I think that it never hurts to ask, you know, and my endocrinologist is like, oh my God, here she comes again with papers printed out, right? We all got to learn together. So I hope that answered the question.
Another question also from Michael is, do you have any update or insight as to when the Omnipod Horizon system will be approved?
So I again, that's the FDA's crystal ball. I know it's filed. I can say that it's filed. I can tell you that the data from the pivotal trial that we conducted in those 6 and up is going to be presented next Saturday, March 20th. At Endocrine Society. So I've known the results for many, many months. I'm not allowed to talk about it. As of next Saturday, please go look. Hopefully, I always say, you know, JDRF, Diatribe, a lot of these organizations, they are reliable sources to get information from. Beyond type 1, you know, I think, you know, we'll see things come out about what those results are. When the FDA will say yes, it's hard for me to say.
Another question is on adjunct therapies, has JDRF or anyone else compiled a list of all those that are being investigated now? It's hard to keep track of all the names of the drugs. That's from Jonathan Gilson.
Sure. No, that's a good idea. To my knowledge, we don't have a succinct list. And you're exactly right. It is hard to keep track of all the drugs. It's hard for me to keep track of the names, and it's my job. What I would suggest is can I provide my email address? It's jrosen@jdrf.org. And I'm happy to give you a short list. And I'll take it up with our colleagues back at the office, whether it's worth doing some sort of, you know, thing on our blog or communicating about this otherwise.
Yeah, I'll type it into the chat. So jrosen@jdrf.org.
Exactly.
And then everybody can see it. So there it is. Okay. All right. There's no other questions in the chat. Everybody's just really wanted to say thanks for the great presentation. It's all been super. So.
Excellent.
Oh, one more. This is from Caitlin. We all know how important mental health is for those with type 1. Is there any program to educate therapists on dealing with patients with type 1?
Yes, that's exactly one of the things we do. So in our psychosocial program, we have sort of 3 broad approaches. One is exactly that, training of psychologists so that they have the diabetes expertise that you need to provide the sort of diabetes focused mental health care that we're talking about. Second is we're developing interventions, like I mentioned, maybe it's cognitive behavioral therapy, maybe it's family-focused therapy. Again, always sort of in a, not just, of course, go talk to a therapist, but always in a diabetes-focused, deliberate, data-driven way. And then the third thing we do is we are constantly pushing for inclusion of psychosocial measurements in our clinical trial. So now when we test a drug in a 3-month trial, we're not just measuring A1C and looking at CGM data. We're also using patient-reported outcomes and collecting as much as we can about the experience of the people with type 1 on the drug, which is incredibly valuable in understanding the full benefits and the risks that the therapy provides.
Any more, Susan?
That's everything.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll wrap up there. I want to thank Dr. Scher and Dr. Rosen. Both are incredibly generous with their time. We're fortunate to have our colleagues at Yale in the backyard, but Dr. Scher always makes time for us. And if you only knew how busy her schedule is, she's hopping off this call onto another call to continue. So we're just really grateful for that. And as well as Dr. Rosen, our colleagues in the JDRF Research Department are fantastic in making themselves available to share this information. And I want to thank all of you. It's all of your fundraising, your advocacy, and your support that makes all of this possible. And we really appreciate it. We will be following up with all of you with some of the information from tonight's call. But as always, if there's questions, things you want to learn more about, feel free to reach out to us in the chapter office, and we'd love to help you. So thank you very much and have a good evening.
All right, thank you.
Have a great night.